This program is brought to you by Emory University.
I want to welcome you and thank you for coming today. My name is Martha Fineman, and I'm a Woodruff Professor of Law at Emory Law School. And I was asked last fall to give the Berman lecture for the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Religion. Unfortunately, I was ill at the time that the lecture was scheduled, so Barbara Woodhouse was kind enough to read some prepared remarks for me at that time, and I was asked to redo the lecture for purposes of taping it so that it could go up on the center's webpage. So that's what we're doing here. And again, thank you for coming so I don't have to do this to an empty room. I'm going to talk about the vulnerable subject and the concepts of vulnerability and resilience today. I direct something called the Vulnerability in the Human Condition Initiative, which brings together scholars who are interested in exploring the concepts of human vulnerability and resilience and their implications for the social justice project of building a more responsive state. The fundamental questions that the initiative addresses are, first, what does it mean to be human? How do we imagine the human being and the human condition? And second, how should that image of humanity inform politics and law? The first question, what it means to be human, is certainly also relevant to world religions, and it's implicit in the methodologies and approaches of academic disciplines as diverse as economics and ethics, as well as philosophy, political theory, and sociology. Like religion, but unlike law and those other disciplines, vulnerability theory places human dependency and vulnerability at the center of the inquiry into what it means to be human. I begin with a discussion of the limitations of law, limitations because law does not in fact address the breadth and the variety within the human condition in its equality jurisprudence. So I want to talk first about equality. United States constitutional jurisprudence requires that in order to be treated equally, individuals who are seen as alike are to be treated as alike or the same. This sameness of treatment, or formal version of equality, positions discrimination as the major impediment to achieving equality. Its methodology is comparative. A person or group of persons asserts that they are inappropriately being treated differently from another person or group of persons, legally indistinguishable from them. In making this comparison, the law ignores most contexts as well as differences in circumstances and abilities on the part of those whose treatment is compared. An equivalence of position and possibilities are presumed. Such a limited approach to equality cannot effectively combat growing inequality in wealth and political power that we have experienced in the United States over the past few decades. This is inequality that is not the result of discrimination against some groups, but results from the privileging of certain interests or positions within society. Profound inequalities in circumstances, status, and well-being are tolerated, even justified by reference to individual responsibility and warnings about the addictive dependency of welfare payments. The state is not required to respond to these inequalities, nor does it have to establish mechanisms to ensure more equitable distribution of economic and social goods. Quite the opposite. The state is restrained from interference with an asserted meritocracy and the workings of a market that is constructed as free. This is the meritocracy thing. You see the little child there starting off with only one box under them while the other one has 6 or so. This equality is unable to intervene to readjust relationships or reorder responsibilities between and among individuals, groups, and institutions. Of course, while this is generally true, over our history, the state has intervened in response to social movements and political pressure. American law does recognize that there have been some distortions in access and opportunity in our free market system. Equal protection jurisprudence developed in the mid-20th century and offers special heightened scrutiny to distinctions that are drawn along the lines of some personal characteristics or social categories such as race, gender, and ethnicity. Now note, significantly, class or wealth and poverty are not within those protected categories. But note, it's not discrimination in general that is given heightened review, but only discrimination that's directed at a few select groups within society, those who were successfully mobilized the political and legal systems to press for their equal treatment, their viable judicial remedy. A person who cannot claim membership in one of those groups is relatively unprotected in law. They can be fired from employment on the whim of an employer, for example, for any reason whatsoever, or be denied housing or access to goods and services. As long as the dismissal or denial is not based on an impermissible classification like race or gender, discrimination is permitted. It's not surprising that this approach to inequality generated a politics of resentment and backlash on the part of those who feel they stand outside of the favored groups. Ironically, it also doesn't always work for the benefit of those who are favored either. One protected group can be pitted against another in what is often perceived as a zero-sum game, dividing those who may otherwise be allies in a struggle for a more just society by casting them as competitors in a struggle over just whose oppression counts. Legal and political battles revolve around the question of whether a specific group seeking protections can be determined to constitute a discrete and insular minority, whether they can show a lengthy history of exclusion and discrimination, thus allowing an analogy to groups that have historically been protected. This is what's now unfolding with lesbians and gay men who are fighting for marriage equality by arguing that their exclusion from the institution is discriminatory and based on animus. In doing so, they draw an analogy to the prohibition of interracial marriage in miscegenation statutes. Those prohibitions were struck down as violating equal protection in Loving versus Virginia in the 1960s. This analogy has generated substantial resentment and resistance on the part of some religious groups and others who don't see marriage equality on the same scale as civil rights struggles over racial oppression. And here we have some of the backlash along this. The upper level is the acclaim for equality. On the lower level, we have Bishop Henry Jackson Jr., who is the pastor at Hope Christian Church in Prince County, Maryland, who does a lot of organizing against marriage equality under this notion that it's insulting to the civil rights movement. The other is religion is a freedom, as a constitutional right, same-sex marriage is not. So again, a backlash to this kind of organizing. I think this fragmenting of progressive forces reflects one of the most troubling legacies of our identity-based anti-discrimination approach to equality. Because it is narrowly exclusive and few groups are protected, those who may not want to see their protections diluted by what they see as a lesser claim to civil rights. But even more significant than that, I think, is the way that an equality discourse that's organized around identity characteristics distorts our understanding of a variety of social problems. Identity categories have become proxies for problems like poverty or a sparse social welfare support system and the failure of public education. The tendency to focus on only certain groups in regard to these problems obscures the institutional, social, and cultural forces that distribute privilege and disadvantage in systems that transcend identity categories. In fact, nestled safely within the rhetoric of individual responsibility and autonomy, identity-based anti-discrimination doctrine actually works to enshrine the notion that America generally provides for real access, real equality in access and opportunity. Targeted discrimination is cast as the discoverable and correctable exception to an otherwise just and fair system in which individuals are at liberty to compete on equal terms. What then happens to those who fail in such a system? They have been herded together by sociologists, political scientists, public health practitioners, and others who study them as members of designated vulnerable populations. The political and legal response to these populations is typically surveillance and regulation. The response can be punitive and stigmatizing, as it is with prisoners, youth at risk, or single mothers needing welfare assistance, or it can be paternalistic and stigmatizing, as are the responses to the deserving poor, such as the elderly, children, or individuals with disability. But note, what is common in those two groups is the stigma that's attached to them. Their perceived vulnerability marks them as deviant, as standing outside of the social contract. Interestingly, sometimes protected identity groups are labeled as vulnerable populations. For example, the Urban Institute Health Policy Center defines vulnerable populations as, quote, groups that are not well integrated into the healthcare system, and it continues, commonly cited examples of vulnerable populations include racial and ethnic minorities, the rural and urban poor, undocumented immigrants, and people with disabilities or multiple chronic conditions. Now, here we have the Obama children and Stephen Hawking, who is a theoretical physicist. And the point in bringing these two photographs to you is not to suggest that the Obama children and Hawking are not vulnerable. And they've been identified as within vulnerable categories by the Urban League, because of course they are vulnerable, but so are all of us. The conception of vulnerability as belonging only to certain groups or populations of people is not only misleading and inaccurate, it is also pernicious. In the first place, clustering individuals into what are conceptualized as cohesive populations based only on one or two shared characteristics, whether those characteristics are identified or identity-based, such as race or gender, or status-based, such as poor or immigrant, masks significant differences among individuals that are so clustered together. Secondly, asserting this group has significant differences from the general population obscures the similarities members of this group will share with members of the larger society. So the categories are both over and under inclusive. However, the most insidious effect of segmenting society so that only some are stigmatized as belonging to vulnerable populations is that such segmentation suggests that the rest of us are not vulnerable. Those who stand outside of the construct of vulnerable population are constructed as invulnerable. Anyone who has ever tended a child, responded to an accident or emergency, experienced a natural disaster, been victim of a crime, fell ill, been injured, or experienced many of the other routine life experiences knows that there is no such thing as invulnerability. But back to my original two questions, fundamental questions. What does it mean to be human? What should be the political, legal implications of the fact that we are embodied beings, which means that we are all born, live, and die within a fragile materiality that renders us constantly susceptible to both internal and external forces beyond our control? Second, how does our understanding of what humanity means inform policy and law? What considerations should be given in political, economic, and legal systems to the inescapable reality of human vulnerability and the inevitable needs, desires, fears, and longings that it provokes? Struggling to answer these two questions has led me to reimagine what constitutes a just state, a state responsive to vulnerability. And this is a legal and political argument that I'm going to be making. There are three parts to my reimagining what the state should look like, a responsive state would be. First, who is, or what characteristics describe the universal legal subject, the subject that's envisioned in the social contract. Note here that we are all bound by the social contract and the law applies to everyone, so the legal subject must be conceived of as a universal. right? It must be a universal subject. Second, how do we understand the legal, cultural, and societal functioning of institutions? So not only individuals, but also institutions. And third, what are the responsibilities of the state in regard to both individuals and institutions as social and legal subjects? So the final consideration is the responsibility of the state. Okay. This is our universal legal subject today. This is our autonomous, self-sufficient, liberal legal subject. All right, so our long-standing universal legal subject is the autonomous, independent, liberal subject of Lochner lore. The liberal subject is a fully competent social actor, capable of playing multiple concurrent adult and incidentally formerly male societal roles. The employer, the employee, the spouse, the parent, the consumer, the manufacturer, the citizen, the taxpayer, and so on. This liberal subject informs our economic, legal, and political principles. It is indispensable to the prevailing ideologies of autonomy, self-sufficiency, and personal responsibility. Society is conceived of as constituted by self-interested individuals with the capacity to manipulate and manage their independently acquired and overlapping resources. Rather than being dependent on or asserting entitlement to the provisions of socioeconomic goods by the state, the liberal subject demands only the autonomy that will enable him to provide for himself and his family. His demand for liberty is reduced to a freedom to make choices, the right to contract. And the primary principle in the social contract in this envisioning is, of course, liberty. Importantly, this demand on the part of the individual also effectively operates as a restraint on the state. The state must not interfere with individual liberty, even for the purpose of ensuring greater social equality. Through a vulnerability lens, however, the image of the human being that's encapsulated in the liberal subject is very reductive, and it fails to reflect the complicated nature of the human condition. A vulnerability analysis asks us, and our economists, philosophers, and politicians, to embrace a much more complex reality by bringing human dependency and vulnerability back into the center of the inquiry into what it means to be human. And what the social contract should entail is a commitment to equality rather than to liberty. A vulnerability approach replaces the liberal subject with the vulnerable subject, who embodies the realization that as embodied creatures, vulnerability is a universal and constant aspect of the human condition. Dependency and vulnerability are not deviant, but natural and inevitable. We will be perceived by others and experience ourselves as weak and in need, as dependent, as well as empowered and strong at different developmental stages in our lives and as we pass through various experiences and environments. Unlike the liberal subject, the concept of the vulnerable subject reflects the fact that humans have a life course. And here is the life course of a man and the life course of the woman. I kind of like this because the man is naked, which further emphasizes his vulnerability. And the woman is actually, at least in some of the things over her life course, in relation, particularly with infants and children. So I kind of like this juxtaposition here. So life course. Over the course of a normal lifespan, we experience a range of developmental and social stages. The trope of the liberal subject, at best, captures only one stage, the freely functioning, unencumbered adult stage of human existence, the stage least likely to reflect the vulnerability of the human condition. By contrast, the vulnerable subject embodies the recognition that individuals will encounter myriad opportunities, frustrations, challenges, successes, and defeats, necessitating a wide range of expertise and capabilities during his or her life. These encounters can be negative, such as those involving disease, environmental catastrophes, terrorism, crime, crumbling infrastructures, failing institutions, recessions, corruption, and physical decline. But they can also be positive, such as those experiences that evoke feelings that seem to arise as we encounter nature or art or a person who generates within us feelings of love, friendship, or compassion. Or when the opportunity to excel comes along, a challenge requiring the demonstration of skills, giving us pride and satisfaction as we perform. We are situated beings who live in the ever-present possibility of changing circumstances, circumstances that may alter our needs and desires, both individually and also in our collective lives. And we will have little or no control over many of those circumstances. In other words, the liberal subject's reliance on resort to liberty and individual agency is at best applicable only to some stages of human development, and even then, only in some situations. A vulnerability approach also recognizes that vulnerability cannot be eradicated. There is no invulnerability, only the prospect of resilience, which will allow us to respond in specific times of crisis or opportunity. And it follows that those who society perceives as particularly vulnerable should not for that reason alone be cast into populations and condemned, stigmatized, or disciplined. While it is true that some may not have sufficient levels of resilience to successfully respond to life's travails at some given moment, we must remember that resilience is not something that we are born with. Rather, resilience is produced over time and within social structures, under social conditions over which the individual might have very little control. Our resilience is found in the resources and assets that we can accumulate over our lifetime. Failure in this rendering is more than merely an individual responsibility. It is a societal failing. This brief encounter with resilience brings me to the paradox, what I call the paradox of vulnerability. And that is, while it must be initially understood as universal and constant when considering the general human condition, as we just did, vulnerability simultaneously must be understood as particular, varied, and unique on the individual level. So on the societal level, it's a universal, but as we experience it, it's particular, individual. Two forms of individual difference are relevant to my analysis in this regard. The first are physical, mental, intellectual, and other variations in human embodiment. So we come in different sizes and all sorts of things. The variations in human embodiment are not socially neutral, and historically some reactions to some variations have led to the creation of hierarchies, to discrimination, and even to violence. Individuals who have certain characteristics have been subordinated and excluded from many of the benefits of society. Often their differences are thought to indicate that they are dangerous or interpreted as inadequacies or inferiority or weakness, and we all know that this happens. As I mentioned earlier, these differences or variations are also the basis for segregation of some individuals into vulnerable population categories, so those differences do that. The appropriate legal response, of course, to these types of biases and exclusions is to improve and strengthen existing anti-discrimination measures and perhaps also build complementary affirmative action and social welfare provisions into the system to make up for past discrimination and also to reduce the possibility of further disadvantage. So that's the first kind of difference. However, it's the second form of difference that I find more theoretically interesting at this point. And these are the differences in social location or positioning of individuals that occurs as we move through our life. This brings vulnerability or the vulnerable subject, more accurately, into conversation and relationship with the state and its institutions. We are differently situated within webs of economic, social, cultural, and institutional relationships. Those relationships structure our options and create or impede our opportunities. Recognizing the significance of this form of situational difference for individual resilience, argues for moving critical inquiry beyond the first category of difference, the differences that reflect our individual identities. We need to adopt an analysis that focuses on structures and institutions and the conferral of privilege as well as positions of disadvantage associated with other differences. A way to think about society's institutions and claims that can be made in regard to those institutions. Claims about equality, not liberty, equality of access and opportunity. Indeed, one way to think about the formation of society is to posit that it is human vulnerability that brings individuals into families, families into communities, and communities into societies, nation states, and international organizations. Further, individuals are continuously dependent on the interactions they inevitably have with institutions and political structures that society has constructed, be these institutions or structures deemed public or private, or whether they are called or labeled family, market, or state. It is through institutions that we gain access to resources with which to confront, ameliorate, satisfy, and compensate for our vulnerabilities, to build our resilience. Now, excuse me, this slide shows the different kinds of resources that I have been imagining to date, and there's various different kinds of them. I won't bother to actually read it. But these resources can come in various forms. Some are material, and this would include things like accumulated wealth. Resources can also come in the form of social goods, such as relationships and ties with families or social networks, as well as human capital that comes from education or training. I also have their aesthetic resources or existential resources, which give us systems of belonging and believing. These resources, again, are accumulated and dissipated in the course of a lifetime in the process of making decisions, responding and reacting to life's circumstances. At times of both crisis and opportunity, our accumulated resources define what are our realistic options and consequentially limit or enhance our autonomy, defining the scope and nature of our ability to actually exercise agency. So note that autonomy is not totally absent from my theory, but it comes after we have equality of opportunity and access. These resources cannot eliminate our inherent vulnerability, but they can and do mediate, compensate, and lessen the experience of that vulnerability. We also should recognize that our experience within institutions are often concurrent and interactive, and that they also can be sequential. For example, the relationship between the educational system and the employment and social security system are sequential. If you do well in one, your chances of doing well in the others follows. Collectively, they provide for the accumulation of resources, creating assets for use in the present and to preserve the possibilities and opportunities for the future. Significantly, the failure of one system in a sequence, such as a failure to receive an adequate education, affects future prospects and is often impossible to fully compensate for, given that given systems that further down the line are constructed in reliance on your successfully fulfilling the earlier tasks, the earlier steps. So your work depends on your having a successful education. Someone who misses out on education typically will have fewer options and opportunities in the workplace and will make for more precarious retirement and fewer savings. On the other hand, and also important, is the fact that sometimes privileges conferred in one concurrent system can compensate or even cancel out disadvantages encountered in others. For example, a good early start in regard to education that's provided by programs such as Head Start may trump poverty as a predictor of success later in school. This is particularly likely when it's coupled, this early childhood education is coupled with the advantages that a social or relational system can provide, such as a supportive family or an active and supportive social network, so that these can all help to overcome disadvantages in other areas. In other words, society's institutions interact in ways that actually produce or fail to produce social, political, and economic opportunities and rewards. They can confer privilege or disadvantage, and an initial privilege or disadvantage may determine if an individual is fully able to benefit from the other systems. Now, because these societal institutions are so vitally important, both to individuals and to society, their flaws, barriers, gaps, and potential pitfalls must be monitored, and the institutions adjusted when they are functioning in ways that are harmful to individuals and to society. So this is the basic demand here, that they must provide equality of access and opportunity. And now would be, of course, a good time to remind ourselves that powerful resource-giving institutions like the family or corporations or schools or financial institutions are constructs of the state. They bring, and this brings the state even more explicitly into conversation now with the institutions and with the vulnerable subject. It is the legitimating authority of law and the regulatory machinery of the state that creates the institutions of marriage, corporations, defines the family, and mandates that corporation form. The state brings these entities into existence and legitimates these institutions. The law both assigns and will enforce content and consequences to these institutions. By doing this, the state asserts that it has a monopoly over the legitimate means of coercion, and this is also one of the ways in which the state constitutes itself. So by creating these institutions, the state is creating or acting on its own authority. This focus on the state relationship to institutions should prompt us, I argue, to reconceptualize the nature and scope not only of individual responsibility, but also of institutional and state responsibility for dependency and for vulnerability. Now, I'm calling this, in this part of the lecture, for a responsive state, because this is the ultimate goal that I'd like to reach. Any call for a responsive state must first, of course, confront the restrained state ideology that is so prevalent in the United States today. So here we have just loads of twisted regulations and the eye looking at, peering over you, and then, of course, the nanny state, because anything that is feminine, we know, is to be despised. All right, so here we go. The assertion that the state is in need of restraint is based on privileging liberty or autonomy for the individual, and also freedom for the market. So you have liberty for the individual and freedom for the market. It ignores the fact that the state actually creates not only institutions as legitimate entities, as I just mentioned, but also that the state creates the conditions under which those institutions operate on a day-to-day basis. That should make it clear that the choice is not one between an active state on the one hand and an inactive or restrained state on the other. The state is always a residual actor. The state not only brings institutions into being through laws and regulation, it also works to protect and to privilege certain entities, such as the family or religious organizations. State mechanisms and institutions, such as law and courts, enforce private agreements, contracts, and provide security and structure in a variety of different ways. In fact, one way of looking at the relationship between institutions and the state is to see that the state is responding to the perceived vulnerability of its institutions. And I can do this by looking at a variety of different institutions, the way the state responds to the institution of marriage, which many people feel currently is under threat, for example. But I prefer a different example at this particular point, and that is the vulnerability of corporations or business institutions. And the state does respond to their perceived vulnerability. For example, they are vulnerable to startup or ongoing production or operating costs. And those costs are routinely evoked to justify subsidies, whether the subsidies take the form of tax policies that favor corporations, direct transfers to corporations, or investments in corporations, or delivered through facilitating access to mechanisms of state authority, such as law, or whether that results from the corporate use of infrastructures and the convenience of having access to a publicly educated workforce. These are all responding to corporate vulnerability. But it is not these forms of state response to market vulnerability that really call forth these demands for a restrained state, and by small government adherence, of course. Rather, the calls are to restrain the state in its monitoring and regulation of the marketplace, calls for the state to adopt a policy of benign neglect of market institutions and let them function freely so that they can work their magic. And the question, I think, to be asked is this reasonable? Is this reasonable? And my answer is no, particularly not if we consider the full range and nature of corporate vulnerability. Indeed, the state responses to the corporation thus far have created additional vulnerabilities. The corporations and business structures are vulnerable to manipulation, misbehavior, or corruption that results from the demands, specifically, that the corporation produce hefty profits for shareholders and massive salaries for CEOs. The vulnerability of the corporation is created by the fact that it is primarily conceived of and constructed as a profit-driven entity. And this actually, I think, provides a compelling argument for a much more attentive and responsive state than we have, a state that's much more attentive to the possible vulnerabilities of corporations. In fact, wasn't the lack of such a state, the lack of a responsive state, an attentive state, a significant factor behind the practices that led to the Great Recession? This decades of deregulation allowed the practices that led to the Great Recession to have. When corporations are unregulated, they act consistent with a profit motive, and they can generate further vulnerabilities for themselves and create hazards for society. Now, consider how the state responded to the increasing vulnerable position of certain big businesses caused by the failing markets during the recession itself. Their financial crises were met with loans to the auto industry and bailouts for the financial industry. At the same time, the financial crises suffered by individual mortgage holders created in the wake of the activities of these corporate actors was ignored. Their plights assigned to the realm of individual responsibility, the individual mortgage holders' responsibility. Their pleas for governmental aid deflected with cries of moral hazard. The state played favorites, choosing vulnerable institutions over vulnerable individuals. It's important to recognize that the state is constantly making decisions about who or what is to be privileged by policy and who or what is not. And that the state can has been abusive, overreaching, and authoritative at times in its history. Like its institutions, the state is vulnerable to capture, corruption, or misdirection. Sometimes the misdirection comes from outside, such as when powerful interest and entrenched interest hijack even the most egalitarian impulses for their own purposes. Often it's the result, however, of flaws or weaknesses in the design and operation of the state and itself and its structures or practices. And I think this is what we currently see in the corrupted legislative culture, which actually produces and provides incentives for repressive tactics, distortions of the truth, and democracy frustrating partisanship. But in the end, in spite of all of these problems with the state, we need the state. We cannot do without it. And state vulnerabilities are present whether the state is constituted as restrained or as responsive. So the state is susceptible to these things regardless of how we construct it. And state vulnerabilities are further, it's important to remember that although we may talk about the state, it is not a monolith. The state is actually a cluster of relationships, entities, and agencies that reflect and shape public norms and values through law and policy. Again, the state is always acting, is always an actor. These relationships include the relationship between citizen and state, as well as between the state and its institutions. To realize a truly responsive state, we as individuals must realize that we too are part of the state, as citizens, as voters, as consumers, as commentators. We do not and cannot stand outside of the state, and we have a responsibility to participate, to be vigilant in seeing that the state is working effectively and in an egalitarian manner. Perhaps all of this is just utopian wishful thinking on the part of a vulnerability scholar. So I could say, oh, this is impossible, right? Certainly orienting the state to be responsible to the vulnerable subject would require dedication to a different set of values than those that inform a state that's built on the liberal subject. Vulnerability values would be more egalitarian and collective in nature. They would recognize and prefer connection and interdependence rather than autonomy and independence in both political and personal visions. The state would be asked to respond to the damage that has been done by privileging liberty over equality. The responsive state would have to respond to that. This would necessitate looking at existing structures of privilege as well as entrenched disadvantage and perhaps dismantling them. At a minimum, institutions that serve to unequally allocate society's resources to the benefit of the few would be monitored and reformed when necessary. Politicians will tell us that this is an impossible task, when what they really mean, at least what I think they really mean, is that this would place them, the politicians, in an uncomfortable position, particularly with those who are privileged. So I want to just end and leave you with two alternative visions of how to think about the responsive state that I'm describing. The first is a utopian vision that looks at good governance, things like consensus, transparency, responsiveness, equitable and inclusive. And the other is the model of the government where we have a free market that's devouring Wall Street and big government is on its way and it looks like a battle of the titans with nobody sure to win. So my version or my preference is certainly for the utopian rather than the dystopian view of the state. So thank you very much.